All right, there's a lot to get through. Let's get moving. Daily Telegraph's national editor James Morrow joins me now, and the Australian's media writer Sophie Ellsworth. Welcome to you both. James, let's just recap, because I think it's so important after listening to that speech from Rishi Sunak last night. I think the failure of leadership in Australia, we had those terrible pro-Hamas rallies in Australia, first on Sunday night, then of course on Monday, facilitated by the police, led to the Opera House by the police, even though they were not authorised. We saw the concern in Melbourne last night that there were people targeting Jewish kids, cars of Arabs, we're told. We've got members of parliament, we've got sporting stars trying to equate somehow Hamas terrorists with Ukrainian freedom fighters. How on earth did a place like Australia get to here?
Peta, it is all so morally bankrupt that it's very hard to even begin to describe what has gone on here. Remember, what we have seen here in Sydney the last few days has been a situation where basically the police decide who gets to run the streets by the weight of numbers and whether or not there's a threat that they will be violent. I interviewed Mark Spiro yesterday. He said that when he was arrested by the police and detained briefly, they said they were concerned about their own safety, i.e. they didn't want there to be any conflict because they didn't want to get hurt. I mean, is this what the police are there for? Do we want to live, Peta, in a situation, in a city, in a country where the weight of numbers and violence decides who owns the streets? Because that's where we're going. And that was the really disturbing thing. You know, and you mentioned that thing going around social media in Melbourne. Here in Sydney, there's been vision of a carload of young Jewish teens with an Israeli flag getting set upon and yelled at by what appear to be a carload of Arab Australians. It is a terrible thing that we're going down this, and Rishi Sunak set exactly the right tone. He gave a masterclass in leadership. There is no moral equivalency here, and Jewish people deserve to be safe. End of story.
We're going to cross to the UK in a moment and speak to the editor of The Spectator on that speech and how Australia has been seen from afar. Let's go, though, to those comments from the Prime Minister today. Sophie, he's accused the Greens, fair enough, but the Coalition, not fair enough, of trying to politicise what's happened in Israel. Now, all Peter Dutton's demanded is that anyone at the rally on Monday night who's not here as a permanent Australian, not a permanent citizen, perhaps on a visa, send them home. Well, that's a no-brainer. And he's asking why on earth has National Security Committee, why has the NSC not met, given the ramifications for attacks here in Australia and all of this Jewish hate now spilling out onto the streets, but also what might happen if Hamas takes this further than what we've just seen over the last few days. I might add too, when MH17 came down and also during the Lint siege in Sydney, NSC under Tony Abbott met 2 or 3 times a day. A day. I am concerned that this government is just not up to the job.
Well, Peter, you make some very valid points there, and I think the opposition leader is well within his rights to ask these questions. As Australians, we want to know what is going on overseas in Israel at the moment is nothing short of absolutely horrifying. And Peter Dutton is well within his rights to ask these questions, Peter. But I get really tired when I hear politicians say, oh, they're playing politics. That just goes... I just think that's a silly argument. Let's get down to what's happening here and why haven't they met and find out and make sure it happens. And I think that is questions that should be made public, and the Australian public should know what is going on, given there's so many Australians over there in Israel at the moment, completely and utterly terrified, Peter, with what is unfolding, and looks like this will continue for some weeks, who knows, months yet.
And of course, we had that statement out of the White House, James, a joint statement involving a number of countries, but Australia, we were a notable absent.
Well, we were a notable absence, and in fact, around the world, Peta, they're looking at social media and seeing vision of what happened in front of the Opera House the other night, our most iconic building that's, an architectural ambassador to the world. And this is the same government, too, by the way, I just remind everybody, that likes to go around saying, oh, well, if we vote no to the voice, the world will be watching, they'll think we're a terrible country, and yet I think the world is actually looking at what's going on in Sydney, in Melbourne, and as you point out, Peta, the conspicuous absence of our name from that joint declaration. It's just shocking, and I just feel like the Albanese government has been caught so flat-footed on this. They had a whole plan about, getting the voice through the last week here, that they took their eye well off the ball with this. And it's just, it's been terrible for everybody concerned, not the least the Jewish community, which has now had to live in fear, which has been told they can't go to commemorate their dead in Israel. I mean, thank God they've got this event going on now in the eastern suburbs, but it's interesting that all the ministers are down at some fundraiser in Melbourne rather than going to, join in solidarity.
I might add there, though, I will stick up the Prime Minister on this point. He has attended a synagogue in Melbourne late this afternoon. He is now at that fundraiser, as you say. I should have vision of the fundraiser. I should also have vision of Peter Dutton at that large event in Sydney. I'll play that when I have it. But just on the media, Sophie, this moral equivalence, in part, I think it's historical ignorance and lack of understanding. I mean, Hamas is a proscribed terror organisation in Australia. In England, the BBC, they refused to call them a terror organisation. They called them militants. Now, that's obscene. But the other night here, the ABC gave a platform to one of the organisers of an anti-Semitic protest, enable that person to say why they didn't like the Israel flag to be there in solidarity on the Opera House. Now, I have a real problem with that too.
Well, Peter, it's pretty disgraceful, but I'm not surprised from the ABC. But just going back to what you mentioned at the start there with the BBC, I mean, that's absolutely disgraceful as well. As you said, Hamas is deemed a terrorist organisation here in Australia and should be described as that. I don't really understand why media are holding back on this. They are what they are. Say what they are. The Australian public, when they're listening to the media report on the events happening overseas, they should report it factually, and that is a fact. But again, we see the media, who are skewed a certain way, trying to kind of protect that, Peter, which is just absurd.
Hey, look, just before we go, Sophie, that very surprise announcement that Cheng Lei is now home in Australia. I understand you've had contact with the family.
Very brief contact this afternoon, Peter. I mean, what an amazing story. Cheng Lei's home after 3 years behind bars in Beijing. I spoke to her partner, Nick Coyle. He lives in Port Moresby. I spoke to him very briefly on the phone this afternoon. He had just landed in Melbourne. He was obviously just totally overwhelmed with what was unfolding, and he was on his way to see Cheng Lei after 3 years. He still hadn't met with her. He was going to see her and be reunited with her and her two children and her family here in Melbourne. I mean, I will say, Peter, for this case, the Prime Minister and Penny Wong, absolute kudos to them. This was such a delicate situation, and to bring Cheng Lei home after what seemed like was a never-ending tale of horror of her remaining behind bars, a remarkable story, and hopefully we'll hear from her in the coming days or weeks when she's prepared to speak to Australians about her amazing return home.
Yes, I echo the credit there to the Prime Minister and to Penny Wong and, of course, our DFAT officials in Beijing. James and Sophie, thank you.